I think we need to talk about the role of traditions in the life of really every person, but particularly in the life of the Christian church. I think the first thing to notice is that everyone has traditions. It's just the natural way that every single person operates. We have things that we just habitually do. We're kind of built that way as humans to find routine and to find comfort in routine. And so every single person has traditions. I think it's interesting when people say we should get rid of traditions, because inevitably what they're going to do after they get rid of traditions is just make new traditions. So traditions in and of themselves are not the problem, but Jesus does have a specific problem with these traditions. To understand that, we need to understand what traditions really are. And my definition for it is traditions are essentially organizing your values. So you see the things in your life that you think are valuable, and then you orchestrate your life in such a way that you repeatedly go back to those things in a way that is appropriate for that value. So let me give an example. If you value family, you will either plan to have family game night in your house every week, or you might plan for a family reunion every year. If you value, for example, your health, you might get up really early in the morning and go out for a run every day or a couple times a week. If you like being in pain for a really long amount of time, you might get up early in the morning and go out for a run every day or multiple times a week. Whatever you value, you set up traditions around those things. And organizations do this too. In fact, organizations probably do it more than individuals, because they have to have some semblance of order among a whole group of people, right? So, for example, our church has a tradition. We call it our liturgy. A liturgy is basically everything we do on a Sunday morning from the beginning of the service to the end of the service. And in that liturgy, we organize our values. So one of our values as a congregation is we love the Word of God. And so the liturgy is containing all different pieces of the Word of God. In fact, literally everything in the liturgy is the Word of God, except the Apostles' Creed, which is a summary of the Word of God. So we're all about the Word of God in our liturgy. But if you have different values as a congregation, for example, if you have a congregation who maybe values a little bit more accessibility for people who maybe aren't part of the Christian church yet, you might change your liturgy and change your traditions to align with your values. And so the same thing was happening here with the Pharisees. They saw this command of the ceremonial washing that God had given for his people to become ritually clean. And they said, we value that. We think it is important for us to know that we have sin. We are wrong before God, but we need to be washed clean of this. And so they took that value and they built a whole bunch of traditions around it, including this ceremonial hand washing. And in and of itself, that's not a bad thing to do. Right? You're just organizing your values. You're building a system in order to value those values, if you will. Where traditions start to go off the rails is when traditions either are imposed on somebody who doesn't understand them, or they actually become the value themselves. So let me explain this. So first, the traditions are imposed on someone who doesn't understand them. If you were to come to my house and you tried to find any number of things, you would probably be pretty frustrated because I have set up my house in a way that makes sense to me and my family. And while I might have a lot of the things that you might look for in a house, you would have a hard time finding them because you don't know where they are. You'd have to go searching for them for a long time. The same thing kind of happens with traditions, especially in churches where people are coming in, new people are coming in regularly. A church has a system, an organization. Everything fits in these places because this is what we value. But a person who's coming in doesn't always understand that. They're coming into the house that's not their house trying to find things. And they're sure that those things are there. It seems that they must be there, but it's very frustrating to try to find those things. And so this is less in the text, but maybe just something for us to think about. Traditions are a good thing, and I think the traditions of our church are a good thing because they organize our values, and I think those values are really solid. But if we're not taking the time to, on the one hand, learn those values in the first place, and then secondly, on the other hand, teach those values to people who don't understand them, the traditions are basically worthless. So my application for you here is that I'm the primary teacher of why we have our traditions and what they do, but I don't know what you don't know. So if there's something that our church does that you're I don't get that, I don't understand why we do that thing. Like, you should ask me, because there is a value that our congregation holds that is behind that thing. And if there isn't a value behind it, or I don't know what the value is, like, maybe we should stop doing that thing. But I'm not going to know that unless you tell me. And for those of you who do know a lot of the traditions that we do and why we do them, like, teach them. Teach them to people. Ask other people, do you know why we do that? It's a really cool thing. It's a beautiful thing. I love that thing, whatever it is. The way you build that community through traditions is by bringing people along into the traditions. Otherwise, traditions just become a stumbling block. But the problem that this text particularly addresses is the second problem that I said, which is when traditions become the values themselves. So remember, I said traditions are essentially organizing your values. But what happens often is those traditions actually become the values themselves. So it's less about whatever the tradition was trying to point to, and more about actually just continuing to do this tradition because it makes me feel comfortable, for example. If you've ever had a roommate or lived with a spouse, maybe you've had an experience like this, where your roommate or your spouse puts something in a certain place that makes sense to them, even though it's completely illogical. They just do that because that makes sense to them, it makes them feel comfortable, but it's completely illogical. That's kind of the idea of, like, I do this because I want to do it, not because it actually makes sense in any way. And that's what was happening with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law here. They had taken their value, made it into a tradition, and then made doing that tradition the value itself. And what Jesus says happens when you do that is you push aside God's commands, the actual values, for this facade that you've created, this exterior that you're just doing for the sake of doing it. I think for us, we can apply this in a couple different ways. First of all, as a body, as a Christian church, and then maybe as individuals as well. As a church, do we think that we are a good church because of the things that are true about our congregation in a functional way? Like, do we think that we're good because, whatever, we have a certain style of worship, or our preacher is X, Y, or Z characteristic, or because we meet in this kind of building, or we have these kind of people, or we do these kind of programs? Or is it maybe that, we have communion every week, and so we value that, and that makes us a little bit better, or we're in worship every week, and that makes us a really faithful congregation, or we give really well in our offerings, all these sorts of things. Are those the things that we define our congregation by? Or is it actually our relationship with Jesus that we define our congregation by? Like, if someone walked into our congregation, would the first thing that they notice be the generous, compassionate love of Jesus? I think if the answer is no to that, then we have some soul searching that we need to do as a congregation, and some conversations we need to have about those things that are not exuding that quality. Because our traditions are great, but if they are not communicating the love of Christ, that Jesus generously, compassionately, sacrificially comes to people and gives them free forgiveness for all of their sins and a promise of salvation, then we are missing the point of church.